enthused about layer masks as much as I am anything else in Photoshop. And there's a little bit of a mystery with regard to layer masks because it's not really apparent when you go to use them exactly how they work. It's not the most intuitive thing in the world, and you either need to follow a tutorial or you need to be told by somebody how these things work and why they matter. So before we actually get into layer masks, let's talk about why you would need them in the first place. And the reason why you would need them is because they are a non-destructive way of erasing. So right now what I've got here is I've got the eraser tool, and if I use the eraser tool on this square, and we can see that this square is on a layer by itself. We can tell it's on a layer by itself because the square has the checkerboard around it, and remember the checkerboard means transparency, and it's against a white background. And if I turn that white background off, you can see the square is on a layer by itself. So if I take this eraser and I erase part of this square, and let's say I save this, I close, and I reopen, there's no way to get these areas of the square back. Now, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal when we're talking about erasing part of a square like this, because this is something that's pretty easy to repair. If it's a square, you just take the rectangular marquee tool, you draw in another square, you fill it with red, everything's fine. But if you're doing a lot of blending of different images together and you're working with photographs or you're working with artwork and you do this and you erase something permanently and you need it back, it's a much bigger deal. It's much harder to get that back if you need it back. And that's where layer masking comes in. This type of erasing that we have here, this is what's known as destructive editing. In other words, we are permanently changing part of an image in order to achieve the effect that we want. Layer masks allow you to erase and bring back parts of an image. And let me show you what I mean by this, and then we'll get into the specifics of how these work. So with a layer mask, I can erase, just like I'm doing right here, or I can go back in and I can unerase. And this doesn't depend on the document being opened. You could save this a month later. You open the document, and if you want this back, with a layer mask, you can unerase. And this is incredibly powerful. I would say that it's almost as important as knowing selections, which is really the basis of most of Photoshop. Let's talk about how to add a mask and how it slightly changes the interface in Photoshop when you do this. For the sake of the demonstration, I'm going to bring the toolbar over so that you can see some changes that happen here. Down here in the layers window, we've got this little icon that is a rectangle with a little gray circle in it. And you can see here, if you leave your cursor over it long enough, it'll say add layer mask. Whenever we click on this, two things happen. One, you get this little window with a chain next to the preview of the object that's on this layer. So in this particular case, it's this red square. The other thing that happens is that your color picker goes to grayscale. And in this particular instance, it goes to absolute black and absolute white. Masks rely on the concept of working with white, black, and variety of grays. Now, if I click on the actual preview itself, and we can see here that the mask is selected because it has those little white frames on the corners of it. But if we click on the actual preview itself, you can see now the preview is selected because it has the little lines outside of the corners. Notice that the color picker goes back to the colors it was before we added the mask. And if we then click back on the mask, the color picker goes back into this grayscale white-black mode. Those are some important things that you need to understand. Any tool that lays paint down onto the canvas can be used to alter a layer mask. So in this particular instance, we have black as our background color, white as our foreground. I'm going to make black as my foreground color so that when I paint down, I'm painting with black. And what you need to remember is that black erases, white unerases, and gray will partially erase. It basically makes the object translucent. Now, if it's a darker gray, it will erase more. If it's a lighter gray, it will erase less. So I created another layer with a duplicate of this red square because I want you to see the difference between using the eraser and using the mask and how it alters the preview in the layers window. So this red square here, I'm going to turn this layer off so that we can't see it. So we're working with this red square right here, and I'm going to use the eraser tool. So if I erase this, and I'm doing, destructive editing by doing this, if you notice in the layers window, in this preview of what's on the layer, you can see that the square has actually been erased. Let me go ahead and turn this one off and turn the masked one back on. And I'm just going to use a paintbrush with black as the foreground, and I'm going to go through and do something very similar. If you'll notice, there's a big difference in the preview. The red square where we used the eraser tool, it actually affected the object on the layer, and it's representing it here. If we look at the layer with the red square on it that has the mask, you can see that even though we have erased part of this, the square is still whole compared to the one below it where we use the eraser tool. And Photoshop is doing this on purpose. It's basically saying the object that you have the mask on is still a whole object, and it's been erased with the mask that's over to the side. That's why those two previews are different. Even though on the canvas itself, both have the appearance of being erased, this preview here is showing the object is still whole, it's the mask that's erasing. So there are three main things that you can now do with this. We can leave the layer alone with the mask on it, and it'll work just fine. We can permanently erase those lines into the square, and we can see it's been erased because that preview changes. Now, let's undo that, and let's say that we want to get rid of this, but we don't want to permanently erase anything out of this square. So I'm just going to take this, drag it to the little trash can in the layers window. That same window is going to come up, and it's going to say, do you want to apply mask to layer before removing? If we hit delete, it will remove the mask, and it will essentially give you the object on that layer as it was right before you put the mask on it. So the question is, what can you really do with layer masks? You can erase things and so on, and what's the big deal? Well, I have a few images that were shot by a really fantastic photographer named Elizabeth O'Neill. These images are a bit old, but I think that the editing that I did on them really displays a lot of good uses for layer masking. One of the things that I did to kind of make this look a little bit more stylized was I actually raised the model's head. I stretched the model's neck a little bit, specifically to give her this tattoo and so on. I wanted to change the focal point of where her face was. So to look at this, let's look at the original image. It really is a situation where you take a very big selection, take more than what you need. It's kind of like cutting a piece of wood down. You can always cut more wood off of a 2x4, but you can't really add any. So let's say that I've got this portion of the model here. I'm going to lift her to a new layer. And let's just add a little bit to her neck. Enough that I could put a graphic on the side of her neck like I did. Right now, you can tell that I elongated her neck simply because we've got some differences in here and so on, and we can see where the selection was. But if we put a layer mask on here, and we get, again, a big feathered brush at first, just to blend, and we put the foreground color on black, because black takes away, then what we can do is we can start to blend this in. Now, certainly on something like this, you want to take more time than what I'm doing here, but this is pretty much the gist of how I did this. So I'm just erasing enough that these will blend together. Now we can see we've got this little bit right here, and I'm going to take care of that by making white the foreground color, and we're going to bring that background back in a little bit, and we'll just try and blend it in. The advantage to this material is that you really can't tell a difference for the most part. So there's the before, and then there's the after. And if this is, let's look at this. Yeah, and I think that transition is okay because that indicates shadow there. But this will show you how powerful using a layer mask really is. Another image that Elizabeth took was actually this image. And the final image that I came up with was this one. But before that, this is what the image looked like without the additional color grading and turning her hair purple and so on. None of this hair actually existed with the model. And what I did was I went into other images that Elizabeth had taken at this photo shoot, and I used a lot of different samples from this model's hair from different images. And I was able to bring them in and effectively blend them together to make it look as if her hair continued. And for the most part, you really can't tell that that's not her hair. And especially after I add the color grading and this kind of lens flare, and you really can't tell. So that's kind of the power of working with these masks, is that you can seamlessly blend things together. It's a very convincing, very powerful effect that you can achieve with a relatively basic set of tools. So one of the things that I wanted to show you, which is a relatively new feature in Photoshop, is the masking properties window. So you can see here what we've got is we've got that square on one layer with a mask on it and some areas removed using the mask. What we have here is we've got a few different options in this properties window. And I'm not going to cover everything here as far as going into refine and using color range and so on. But what I want you to know that's in here is you have the ability to change the density and the feathering. The density is essentially the transparency or translucency of the mask. So if I bring that density down to 60%, this is really only a 60% mask at this point. It's kind of, and you can see here in the preview, it turned what was black to gray, which we know is used in making translucency in Photoshop. We can also go in and we can feather in addition to this. So if we wanted this to be a much softer set of transitions, we can do this. So I hope you enjoyed this look into the layer mask. I think that's where I'm going to stop for today. There are some other options within the layer mask window that deal with vector masks, but that really takes a video that goes into vectors and using the pen tool and so on, and I'd like to keep this video around 15 minutes just so that it's a little bit easier to watch. So again, thanks for watching today, and I hope you found something valuable out of this.